This is Monday, August 31st, 2020. We are about ready to look at the Peloponnesian War and Alexander the Great. Now, a bit of a recap. In 490 BC, the Persian army led by Darius is going to invade here at Marathon, where they will be defeated by the soldiers from Athens. Then 10 years later, in 480, the Persians, led by Xerxes, are going to invade Greece, and here at Thermopylae, they will destroy Leonidas and the 300 Spartans. They will destroy Athens, and then the Athenian navy will destroy the Persian navy here in the Straits of Salamis. The Athenians are forced to rebuild their city, and Athens is about ready to go into what is called the Golden Age. Now, it is the Golden Age, and with Athens will begin a massive rebuilding effort. Much of the architecture that we're going to talk about this week was built during this Golden Age. Athens will begin to align itself with about 150 other city-states in Greece. The hope is that Athens will gain a monopoly on all of the trade that is accomplished by water. Now, to accomplish this, Athens and the other 150 alliances will create the Delian League. Now, this is a new slide, this next one here. Sorry about that. The alliance that Athens had created was going to go against its maritime rival, Corinth, which is right here. Now, Corinth had aligned itself with Sparta, and as Athens' naval power grew greater and greater, Corinth believed that it was just a matter of time before the Athenians would take over their city-state. And so soon it was evident that a war would happen between the Delian League of Athens and the Peloponnesian League led by Sparta. Now, the alliance is going to pit just about every city-state in Greece. Either you are for Athens or you are for Sparta. And the war that breaks out, that's going to last for about the next 40 years, is called the Peloponnesian War. Now, during the war, the Athenian navy is going to win countless victories, but the Spartan army is going to lay siege to Athens. Now, the Athenians feel pretty good because most of the grain is being imported from other Delian alliance city-states. Unfortunately, a plague breaks out. The leader of Athens, Pericles, and his son are going to die because of this disease. And for 20 years, the fighting goes on and on and on. Eventually, Athens will sue for peace.
The war between Athens, leader of the Delian League of Allied City-States and Colonies, against Sparta, leader of the Peloponnesian League, pitted a powerful navy against one of the most dominant infantry forces in history. Preceding this conflict, Athens had defeated a Persian invasion force at the Battle of Marathon. A decade later, a much larger Persian invasion force suffered major setbacks and defeats at Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans famously fought to the last man. Then at Salamis, the Persians were dealt a major naval defeat against the Athenian navy. And finally at Plataea, the Persian army was defeated on land, before downsizing and eventually abandoning the campaign. For the next half-century, both states followed an anti-Persian policy and supported any anti-Persian activities in the eastern Mediterranean, allowing for an intermittent peace to exist between Athens and Sparta. In order to fight the Persians at sea, the Athenians formed the Delian League. By exercising more and more control over the members of the league, Athens converted this coalition into an empire, exacting tribute from its members. From the money extracted from her client states, Athens built herself into a city that was the envy of the Hellenistic world, and a fleet of 300 triple-banked galleys. Each of these triremes was manned by a crew of 170 professional oarsmen. The city-state of Corinth had been the dominant maritime power prior to the Persian Wars, and as Athens' power grew, her navy outnumbered Corinth's fleet 3-1, and began to incite rebellion in their colonies and encroach on its trade routes. In a series of small conflicts lasting 15 years, known as the First Peloponnesian War, Sparta opposed Athens and defeated the Athenian army in one non-decisive engagement, while Athens continued to expand her naval power. One significant development during this period was the rebuilding of Athens' walls on a grand scale, with a long causeway connecting Athens with the port city of Piraeus, allowing Athens to be fully supplied by sea, even if an invading army would destroy the surrounding countryside and farmland. This hostile period ended with the so-called 30 Years' Peace between the two city-states, that would last for less than half of its intended duration. Despite this peace, hostility between Athens and Corinth continued, and in 431 BC, Corinth successfully convinced Sparta and the Peloponnesian League to declare war on Athens, with the goal of ending the burgeoning Athenian Empire. The first phase of the Second Peloponnesian War, commonly referred to as simply the Peloponnesian War, is known as the Archidanian War, where Sparta pursued a policy of pillaging the countryside around Athens in an attempt to provoke a pitched battle. The Athenians had anticipated the Spartan strategy and had organized a continuous flow of grain shipments from Egypt and colonies on the Aegean and Black Sea coasts. The Athenian strategy was to blockade the Peloponnesian Peninsula from any trade and supplies, while opportunistically raiding Sparta's allies. While initially the Athenians seemed to be maintaining the upper hand in this asymmetric war of attrition that had been carefully planned for years by the Athenian statesman Pericles, the population from the surrounding countryside poured in behind the safety of the Athenian walls in the early stages of the war. This had been taken into account beforehand, and wealthy Athens had more than enough food flowing into the crowded city to feed everyone. What had not been taken into account was tainted grain shipments carrying plague, which rapidly spread through the overcrowded city. Initially, the city was resilient, inspired by the charismatic rhetoric of Pericles. An estimated 1 in 4 Athenians succumbed to the plague, including Pericles and his sons, before it had run its course. At the height, mercenaries refused to fight for Athens, and even the Spartans ceased to campaign near Athens for fear of catching the plague. Ironically, the masterfully planned Athenian blockade of the Peloponnese had protected Sparta and its allies from receiving any of the plague-tainted grain. The Athenian survivors adopted a much more aggressive strategy, greatly increasing the raids and building fortified outposts along the Peloponnesian coast. The Helots, Spartan slaves that outnumbered them 10-1, were encouraged to run away to these outposts, which put pressure on Sparta to defend the home front. This phase of the war ended with the 50-year Peace of Nicias, which never really went into full effect, with both belligerents raiding each other through proxies from the onset, and eventually directly. In 415 BC, the Athenians devised a plan they believed would bestow upon themselves an overwhelming advantage: the conquest of the fabulously wealthy city-state of Syracuse, on the island of Sicily, who along with Athens and Carthage, controlled the lion's share of Mediterranean trade. Led by the young charismatic Athenian statesman Alcibiades, the expedition ended in disaster, with Athens losing over 10,000 hoplites and 2/3 of her navy. Ships could be rebuilt, but the 30,000 professional oarsmen could not be replaced. This was followed by further disasters. Sparta freed 20,000 Athenian slaves in the city's silver mines. Athens then raised the tribute from her vassals, which caused widespread revolt in Ionia, for which this final stage of the war is named. The Athenian general Alcibiades, fearing retribution for his failure, switched sides and fought for Sparta, who began to receive vast sums of money from the Persian Empire, who viewed the Athenian Empire as a greater threat. With this, Sparta built up its fleet and combined with its Corinthian allies, decisively defeated the Athenian navy at Aegospotami. Athens, now effectively without a navy, was besieged by Sparta and promptly surrendered. Spartan hegemony over the Greek world would be short-lived. Its most precious resource, Spartan warriors, had become far too low to maintain an empire. And after a series of smaller wars, in the aftermath of the Peloponnesian War, Philip of Macedon, the father of Alexander the Great, was able to conquer the decimated Greek city-states?
Well, as we heard from the video, all of the city-states of Greece were weakened by the war. This allowed Philip of Macedonia to begin his rise to power. Now, just north of Greece lies the city-state of Macedonia. Now, Macedonian King Philip was able to swoop in and take over the various Greek city-states because neither Sparta or Athens had enough men to defend the city-states. In 336 BC, all of the city-states in Greece had capitulated to Philip. It was at that time that Philip was assassinated by poison, and his son Alexander became king. Now, Alexander had been educated by the Athenian Aristotle. Most Greeks looked upon Alexander as one of their own. Alexander wanted to acquire more land. He wanted to build an empire with all of the Greek states banding together. Now, he began this quest by traveling south into Egypt. In 326, Alexander and his armies took control of the lower Nile. They controlled Egypt, they controlled most of the Persian Empire, they controlled most of India. Alexander developed a fever and died in what is now Babylon. No one could get Alexander's army to follow them and pledge loyalty, and soon the great Alexander's empire fell apart.
Alexander the Great wanted to be both human and divine. He wanted to have a supreme power over other human beings that could never be questioned.
Alexander the Great was born in 356 BC to the Macedonian King Philip and one of his foreign wives, Olympias.
There are many myths behind Alexander's birth, one of which is that Philip had a vision that a snake was sleeping with Olympias. And it was these visions that were confirmed by oracles that made Philip believe that Alexander was a son of one of the gods.
Alexander grew up in Pella and was tutored by Aristotle.
Macedonia at the time of Alexander's birth is still considered to be a rude, rather barbarian by Greek standards sort of place. Bringing Aristotle in to tutor Alexander is like bringing culture to your rude barbarian society.
In 336 BC, at a royal celebration, Philip was fatally stabbed by Pausanias, one of his guards.
Once Alexander became king, he prevented the empire from collapsing and splitting by first going down to the Greek city-states and securing their allegiance. He burned the city of Thebes to the ground and dismantled it. He slaughtered all the male inhabitants and enslaved all the women and children.
Over the next several years, Alexander and his armies started east, conquering everything from Greece to India.
Alexander's most impressive victory was at the Battle of Issus in 333 BC. Alexander faced odds of 5-1 against the Persians led by King Darius. What finally made him stop was his soldiers finally decided they had enough. They were ready to go back to Macedonia.
On his way back to Macedonia, Alexander had many of his officers marry Persian noblewomen in an attempt to solidify his reign over Persia.
There was considerable opposition to Alexander's rule as king of Persia from his own Macedonians. The Macedonians saw him becoming less and less Macedonian and more foreign.
After a sudden illness, Alexander the Great died in Babylon in 323 BC.
No one knows what caused Alexander's death. I mean, whether or not he was poisoned, as many rulers were in that sort of mafia crime family-like existence, malaria has been thrown out as a possible thing. And a lot of battle wounds may have begun to take its toll, too. It's one of the great murder mysteries of the ancient world.
Alexander the Great would inspire future leaders like Julius Caesar and Napoleon Bonaparte.
Alexander the Great is one of the most romantic figures throughout history. He's got one of those sorts of existences that is so compelling that people have been captivated by it for thousands of years.
Okay, well, we're going to stop here today. We're going to look at Greek culture for the rest of the week. I remind you that your Greek god paper is due by the end of this week. Also on Thursday, we'll probably be doing some work in class. I would imagine that sometime next week, we will be looking at a day for a quiz.